Hey everybody, it's Thursday.
And welcome to this week's edition of the Night Bite.
I'm Josh.
And I'm Emily. And thanks for being here with us this evening.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, before we even do that, almost Josh's birthday. So I guess it's actually in 2 days. I'm a little bit early, but happy birthday to Josh. So if you're out there,
Oh, thanks.
yeah, that's coming up this weekend. So I'm really looking forward to whatever fishing adventure he gets us into because I might make him choose this weekend.
What I get us into.
But fishing this past weekend, we actually had an extra day to head out there because of the holiday. And so certainly, you want to celebrate holidays for the reason that they are. But we were able to celebrate in the outdoors. So how was fishing for us?
Hot.
Good point.
It was hot. No, fishing, we had lots of some really high highs and some really low lows, as our friend Clayton Schick would say about lake trout fishing. Apparently it's the same for panfish around northern Wisconsin. No, actually it was a pretty great weekend. Hi Joe. We started out doing some doing some local lakes we haven't been on for a while because we've been trying to get some new water under our belts before this next winter comes, because it's already June today. And did just threw some stuff at the shorelines and did a little bit out deeper and caught fish kind of anywhere between like 3 and 12 feet. So that was kind of fun. And then our buddy Nathan, who we used to be neighbors with, but we moved up north, and he has a cabin up on Lac Vie des Airs. We did pretty good up there. Got to see him a little bit, and that we trolled a lot for panfish up there, so that was nice to get on a good trolling bite to start off our summer. And then then we went over to another lake and tried trolling, and they weren't as hungry.
But what you are pointing out is that we did do quite a bit of traveling, north and kind of in our region. So a lot of people will call us kind of the beginning of the Northwoods anyways. But, either way, it was a large region that we were in. The point of what I'm saying is that the water temperatures were actually quite similar across all of the regions of where we were at. So I don't know how it is south of us, but at least where we are and north, water temperatures all seem to be, similar. Around that low to mid 60s, depending on the part of the day. Because as Josh was saying, that heat was, I was going to say the heat was hot, that warms up the water. I guess all of those things make sense, and it sounds kind of stupid, but those are the things that affect the fish this time of year. The other thing that we were seeing is different amounts of wind. So when you have very stagnant air, you really tend to see those surface temperatures really climb up fast. But then the water just tends to sit there. And those are some of those occasions where those fish are in those super shallows, because where they find that warmest water is that shallowest part. But if you have days that are super windy and it is pushing that water around, there are waves, remember that warmest water gets pushed around as well. So you're going to want to find, is the wind blown side of the lake? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, as a general rule, it's not always the case.
Not always the case. But in those cases, you will find sometimes water temperatures are mixed up, or sometimes fish are doing things that you don't expect. But one of the things that we were learning about this, though, is with water temperatures, being in those mid 60s, the thing is not all the fish spawn at the exact same time. Sometimes people think, ooh, like a magic number this or timing on that, or, but I mean, I think for each individual fish, it varies at least a little bit. And so there is a lot of people that are really stuck in habits, I guess, of how they need to fish this time of year. They have an old waypoint. They have to be on that spot fishing in one way. And I think that's part of what has brought us to our topic today, because we see a lot of people out using just these little red and white bobbers and stuff. But we're finding success in other ways. And I think we are here to talk about some of that this evening.
Yeah. So I don't know. It's funny. I'm just thinking you brought up like people have their spots and they're coming out in it. It's funny because I know you're thinking of a couple specific instances this weekend where we were trolling, and like we probably had like, I'd almost call it like a 3/4 of a mile. Maybe it was like a half mile long troll, and it was all similar types of water. We kind of figured out that fish were holding to what vegetation had come up already, and so when we hit those vegetation clumps, we tend to get bites. And it was really funny because people were pulling out like right and parking in front of us, and then we'd have to go around them, and then we'd start catching fish again, and it was all the way down. And it's just funny that people had that mindset. And I think a lot of what we saw this weekend too was floats, bobbers. People were throwing those off the side of the boat. They'd they'd get their anchor out, get in upwind of their spot, throw their anchor down, and then float into their spot and just sit there, and then we troll around them. And I find that that's kind of the case this time of year. And you jump in whenever you want, but it's one of those things where just because you're float fishing doesn't mean you have to be still. I would say 90% of the boats that we were out there fishing with had trolling motors on. And even if they wanted to bobber fish, they could have bobber fished that whole 3/4 mile stretch that we were fishing with floats. And they could have just bumped around with their trolling motor. They wouldn't have had to anchor.
Here's where I'm going to jump in. And here's why, is because this is one of my favorite reasons for doing this podcast is, what we do, what anybody does, and any person out there, any of you that are listening, if I came up and I asked you, what is your best technique? What's your go-to? What do you do most often? Your confidence situation. And we all have kind of something, maybe our favorite way to fish, or, however you answer that, we all have that. But the funny thing is, for each of us, it's going to be different. And it's also for each of us, that's our easiest way to fish. And so my easiest way is not the same as your easiest way or somebody else's. So we don't want to make assumptions out here. And so we're going to explain, first of all, that one of the reasons that we're talking about this is a lot of people join us thinking that like bobbers are a static situation. Okay. So first of all, there's a million different styles, and we'll try to hit on that. But I think that's why you call them floats. I think don't get stuck in it being like a kid's bobber, because there's so much more that you can do with it. And one of those things is movement. I think, though, the other thing that you're kind of alluding to is you can be moving that bobber. You can also be moving the boat. And you can do both those things effectively and be catching fish. So when you're referencing that, what does that look like for you or for us?
Well, so when I'm referencing moving the boat, I'm just saying that you should pay attention. You shouldn't put so much stock into spots that you've already caught fish.
Why? Because
there's more than one of those spots in the lake.
And there's more than one of those fish.
Well, right. I'm just saying, like pay more attention to when you get bites instead of where you get bites, I guess, is kind of where I would guess I would put that category of question, is that where you get bites is far more important than, where, when, I don't know.
What Josh was saying is that when you are getting a bite, one of the things that he does, and not always, but put a mark on the graph. And when you find that trend line, so if it is the weeds, or if it is the depth, or if it is a region, or by plants or whatever, then you're able to target that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I was saying.
But I think for a lot of people, that's a little bit novel, because for so many people, you go out, you pick a spot, you anchor, you throw out a bobber, and so first of all, we see a lot of people this time of year using this. Is this effective?
Yeah, it can be. You can utilize that you can utilize it as a slip float. You can utilize it as a clip bobber. You can utilize it as just.
You cannot use this as a slip float.
Yeah, it has.
Show me.
Well, not this one.
Not that
specifically, one. But there's other ones that have two little holes. One hole is for the whatever. You know what I mean.
I'm looking at my backs for an example right
I
now, but
can't
that's
show
not
them.
necessarily something that you can see right now either, because they are very small pieces. So, there are different options. Static. I mean, these are cheap. These are just something that people always, I think, have around. And Jill, I love your question about this on jig size. This is a super important thing that we're about to get into this, I guess, because that's so important. I think so often people go out and they just choose this giant bobber, and actually even one's way bigger than this.
Mhm.
I found this one at the lake. So maybe this is a great example of what people use because it was out there, and I think you use a size because you can see it. When you cast it on out there and there's just enough weight that you can kind of get it out there, then you can see where it's at and good to go. But it's not necessarily good to go because I guess before we even talk about jigs, or I guess this is the beginning of it, the key to bobbers is actually matching the bobber fairly close with the weight of the jig.
Yeah, I mean, let's kind of back up. Let's start with
The thing is, we love bobbers so much, and there's like a million things to talk about, and it's all at once.
So
first,
we're gonna start. Okay, so Emily told me this morning that we were gonna do, or yesterday morning that we were gonna do this show, and the problem is I personally am very passionate about float fishing. I believe it's underutilized in the way that it should be. And I'm hesitant to say should because that's something that would be my opinion, but I truly think that there's so much potential that people from a boat, people from shore, people from bridges, like they underutilize floats in every situation, and I still underutilize floats. So I guess where I'm going with this is that I'm having a hard time like setting up a foundation, and I'm thinking about where I want to go with this conversation. And I think where we should start, now that there's kind of a lengthy quagmire of introduction.
Welcome to the intro. Yeah, as if that was the beginning of this.
Okay, so let's start out with your rod and your reel. Okay, because this is something that is way overlooked. And especially in the realm of panfish, because and I grew up like this too. We were fishing like the big bluegills and big crappies with ultralight tackle, and that's super fun. But that's almost like fishing musky with a walleye rod. It's because you're not targeting like the dock fish, like the little tiny stuff that's up ashore. You're targeting the bigger mid-lake fish. And with that ultralight tackle, yeah, it's really fun, but it's not what you should be using. So when you're setting up a bobber rod, and I really think if you're a pan fisherman, that you should have a dedicated float rod. Look for something that's in the medium light category, and it can have a medium or a fast action. I prefer a fast action, just because of the way I fish with the float. But if you use that power of a rod, a medium light power, what that's going to do is that's going to increase your cast immensely. That's going to increase your control over any fish that you catch, because inevitably,
you never know what you'll catch.
Yeah, inevitably you're going to catch a big pike or a big bass or a catfish or anything, and having that little bit of extra backbone, you think that it's overpowered for some bluegills, but when you're catching bluegills, it puts a bend in that rod. Are
you catching bluegills? I think because you're not taking me with you.
I don't know. Have you looked at your pictures lately?
Keep going.
So the next thing would be when you got your medium light set up, look at a 2,000 or even a 3,000 caliber reel. The reason for that is because you have a bigger spool diameter, and so you can pick up line faster. And even if you don't want to fill that whole spool with expensive line, just put some cheap mono, fill it halfway up, tie on your good line, and fill it up, because you don't go through that much line when you're float fishing, So it's kind of like filling up an ice fishing rod. You don't need the whole spool of your good line.
But actually, Kobe's making a great relevant point here, talking about braid with a floral leader. And that's very much like what we do because, first of all, I do love using braid. I like to fish often around like trees and brush and cast into things that I should not be casting into. And I just think that strength of the braid, I just like using that. But one of the downfalls to that is that if it is a really windy day and there's just a little bit of extra slack or whatever on your cast or, getting your line right, that wind drags it. And so, I think having the ability to have that larger reel, the 3,000 size reel, even to pick up all of that extra line is one of the things that's going to increase your hook sets. Because there's always that moment where you cast and your bobber hits the water and it keeps going, but you have line caught in the wind and you are doing everything you can to set that hook, and there's just not enough pull to that line to do it, and sometimes you get it, but sometimes you don't. And those times that you don't, that's where that reel would come in handy.
So going from that reel size recommendation, that walks us into line. That was a good segue. You can use braid, and I used braid for a long time. I found through research, if you look up float fishing, and don't type in bobber fishing, because what you'll get is a bunch of stuff about fishing crappies in shallow water or bluegills in shallow water. Look up float fishing, because the rest of the world that uses floats correctly, that's what they call it. And there's one thing that I picked up from a very serious float angling community. It is steelhead fishermen. They have specific float line. They have it's monofilament. It's super floats, so it is meant to sit on top of the water. And so what that does is, if you've ever fished with mono or floral, especially, braid's not so bad until it gets kind of wet, but it'll sink. And then when you go to pull up, you get that kind of initial tug on your jig before you're even, because it has to go under the water to come out. The float specific line, I use this, I can pull it up later, but it's something from Sunline. It's a high vis line, sits on top of the water, and what you get is like a really easy casting line, and it floats, and it's meant for float fishing. So now if we're looking back, recapping, you have the medium light rod with a 2,000 or 3,000 reel. Now you got some actual float fishing line on it. Now here's something that not many people do. Sounds like Colby does it. There's a leader that goes on that line, and I always put a swivel on it. And I've talked about this. Well, they can't see it anyways, because it's so little. It's meant for fly fishing.
It's literally smaller than the beads of my ties.
And so you always put a swivel between your main line and your floral leader. You can adjust that leader length. It doesn't, if you're fishing stained up water, you can fish a foot of leader, because then you can put your bobber all the way down to the swivel and just be fishing that much water, just like you could a clip float. Or you can fish a long leader if you're fishing deeper. It doesn't seem to really matter that much, especially when you're getting up into shallow water. So you got your main line, swivel, and even if it's a little bit bigger swivel, just make your leader a little bit longer. We use beads on both sides of our floats just to keep the swivel out of the float. And a lot of times we'll get bites on the beads because they're an attractant. And so, instead of scaring off fish, maybe you can utilize that bead or whatever as an attractant and cover up that swivel a little bit. And then when you get all this set up, now you're ready to start picking out.
It sounds too hard. I'm out.
Well, now you got all that stuff figured out. So now you got to figure out what float you're going to use with what jig you're going to use. And that's what Jill was asking earlier. So there's a rule in float fishing that use the biggest bobber that you can get away with. So you can, if you're using like 1/80th or 1/64th ounce jigs, you might only be able to get away with something like that. If you're going up to 32nd or 16th ounce jigs, you can use something like this, which is a little bit bigger. And there's all what I guess Emily's showing here is that there's all different shapes and sizes, and that comes into play the more you learn about float fishing. All of those different shapes have a purpose, and a style of fishing associated with it. There's even, they have the porcupine quill ones, and that's one that I don't use often, but it is valuable to have in the tackle box because on super windy days, these are really nice because there's nothing to catch the wind. And usually if we're using these, it'll be in a little bit shallower water, so you can cast up, you don't get tangled up so much. So
but I guess one of my questions for Jill, I guess after even listening to Josh, sometimes I learn things from you, I guess even. But sometimes. What kind of bobber is your favorite? You were talking about it being a slip bobber. And so it makes me wonder if it's something like pretty small or if your jig is like super big. So if it's larger than an 1/8 ounce, gosh, an 1/8 ounce is pretty big. If it's larger than a 16th, let us know. Cause then I don't know, I would start looking at some of this other stuff. This is a Clearly Outdoors slip lock bobber, and they're fun because they come in like a whole bunch of different, gosh, that's hard to translate. This one's like orange and yellow, and you can't even see that in here for some reason. Screen. Oh, the green screen. Yeah. This pink one. I mean, there's like a million more colors than that. Green, white. There's this fully black bobber. I mean, that's actually pretty interesting. Oh, and awesome. So Jill, sounds like some of this might be relevant to you anyways, but I mean, one of the reasons I have such a big bobber collection, I feel like I keep wanting to show this to you, but it's like so hard to tip it, is because there are so many different applications. I mean, I guess, so that's why I keep knocking on this bobber. Oh, you're leaving us. That's why I keep knocking on this bobber. There's nothing wrong with it at all. And by golly, you will catch fish. And like I said, I think people use it because it's already in so many people's tackle box. But the thing is, all this can really do, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but you can get it out there and it will float, and it might tell you if there's a fish big enough to start pulling it under, or if a little fish, sometimes you see it swimming around, that's interesting. But I think that's why other bobbers exist. So I guess a really easy example, rocket bobber came around because this bottom tip actually has some weight to it, or maybe it's inside of it. I guess I've never really thought that close. But these are meant for really casting them out there. So they have some interesting action, and it is a clip at the bottom style float. So that's, unique from others. But that is going to have different action from actually even what I have in my hand, just this traditional, what do you call this? A pencil style float?
Yeah, I would call that a pencil style float.
And so all of these have different actions. One of the things that I like, though, is using the strength. So again, if you are trying to cast and whip something out there, go with a rocket bobber, in my opinion. If you are trying to, gosh, now I'm trying to get in everything, but I'm interested in all these things that you've grabbed. So that's funny. But one of the things that I like most in a bobber, and I'll actually show both these examples because I like them for the same reason, I guess. So this one is, normally there's like a little top to it. I wonder what happened to that. It doesn't matter. But it is a line through the very bottom. Can you see that little hole there? That's really hard to see. The thing about this bobber is it looks pretty small, but what is it made out of, like balsa wood or something super buoyant, I guess. I don't know the actual science of bobbers. But this is able to hold, most of the tungstens that I might use. So if I'm looking for that super tiny profile, this floats about that. If I'm using like a 32nd or a 16th jig, like this is pretty awesome. If I'm going bigger than that, I don't know if I can actually really use this, but sometimes a 16th, like a 32nd jig, that's all that I need for bobber fishing, I guess. But what you can do is that line goes through the bottom, and this one, it bounces really nice in the water. So this is just one that I like to use. But this casts out and this would float. This is just the tag. I guess I should take that off. I mean, you know what a bobber looks like. This is not that new to you people, right? But one of the things about this is I like bobbers that are going to show me certainly that down bite when fish like take it and run and it like flies under the water. Everyone gets that. But the other thing that these do is that they help you to detect that up bite. So what an up bite is literally that fish comes up and like lifts your bait as it's swimming up. You know, fish eat up in a lot of cases. And so what happens to a bobber like this is that fish bites upward, and instead of going down, that bait's not going down, it's going to the weight is released and they fall right to the water. And then you can see that movement. You know, the lake doesn't pick up that bait. You know, that sounds stupid. The only thing possible is a fish. So if you see that bobber go under, you set the hook. But if you see the bobber fall, you set that hook as well. And I just think that there's so often that fish eat up. And again, like not knocking this red bobber because it's awesome, but a huge flaw in this, in my opinion, is that you can't see an upbite. So often a crappie is an upbite. Sometimes bluegill, sometimes other things, you know, and it's not always. But if you are able to set yourself up, even just with a different bobber option, you might catch more fish right off the bat.
So, yeah. So, I mean, going back to that, you were talking about using tungstens with those. Maybe something that would alleviate it as you go further along in the season. Instead of sticking with that tungsten, you could add heavier weight to your line and set that bobber further in. So even a red and white style bobber like this can indicate an upbite is if you have enough weight on it. Because if it's sitting that far into the water and then the weight comes off of it, it's going to sit like that. Any bobber that you have line coming through the bottom, it's going to do that. You just have to have it weighted appropriately. A good thing to do, especially if you get serious into this, is just to set up take some tip-up line or take some extra monofilament and put a knot on the top of it, run it through your slip bobbers or clip it onto your clip bobbers and just tie different size jigs on it. See how it floats in a glass or something. And then you can could even write on it, you know. Any of this stuff is all plastic. Just use a permanent marker and write, you know, 1/8 on it. And then you know that that's the bobber you should be using for that application.
And after a while, you'll get used to that and you won't have to always test them or mark them. But certainly as you're getting used to your tackle box, maybe it's a new bobber. You found something online, try this out, try that. That's a really great way to know how to match up your tackle.
Yep. So kind of the next thing.
Wait.
What?
While we're talking about bobber types, because there is, I guess, one other important note that I have, you know, when you think about bobbers and you're spring, summer, fall fishing, you go to the store, you need a bobber. Now you're open-minded. You're going to try a new shape or something, whatever. And that's awesome. Go and support your local bait shops because they're great and that's what they're there for. But I would also say, like, don't forget to look in the ice fishing section or look in the trout fishing section or look in, you know, I mean, fishing to some extent is fishing, or floats are floats, bobbers are bobbers, you know. And so we were talking about, for example, this little one. And this is actually in part a recommendation from Ryan Salemi, because he found somebody who was making bobbers on eBay. And then it turns out that guy was making this other shape that I found that I liked as well. You know, we showed these tiny things, you know, that's certainly taken from ice fishing. I don't expect you to go out in waves and use a bobber like this. But you never know what that application is like, because like we said, maybe it's like a foam type bobber. Maybe that just maybe you have a million of them sitting around at home. And especially those ones with that little plastic tubing, that yellow bobbers, the ice stoppers, I think what they're called, you know, you can cut them down to any size that you need. If your kids are going out with you, they're changing jigs, you know, that's something that's adjustable. And that's actually kind of a fun thing, you know, challenge them to try to do that. But I even mentioned trout fishing, and this was a recommendation from Josh a while ago that I was super uncomfortable with, because well, I guess one of my hardest things is seeing them. Do you have a colored example of this?
Yeah.
But what I'm going to point out about this is that both of these bobbers are clear. So a lot of times, I guess I almost hesitate to tell people this, because early spring when you're fishing, first of all, I will tell you, don't fish the bedding fish. Like, let them reproduce so we have fish for later. But I'm also not here to control what you do and, all of that stuff. And so I will tell you that if what you're doing is fishing for shallow fish, then you at least better do it the right way. And sometimes when you cast a bobber out there, and for example, we're all talking, we love this rocket bobber. Yes. But if I cast this in the shallows, this is going to plop right on in there. And in some cases, not all, but in some cases, it will scare the fish away. When you're using a clear bobber like this, and you cast it out there, and you may still get some of that plop, maybe not quite as much as a rocket bobber. But what happens is that this comes to the surface of the water and looks exactly like a bubble. And is this one even called a bubble bobber? Or this one, actually?
Yeah, they're both called that.
So they're different styles. This one is a line through, and it's a really unique thing where you actually, gosh, you can barely see that. You lift that top and you spin this around your line. The tension holds that right back in, and it is a line through bobber. So you can always adjust it and do that. It's nice because you don't necessarily need like a lock or a tie system, because in most cases this holds it on. It is pretty fun. You also have this style, which is a line through as well. Like I said, they're kind of hard to see. And so Josh did like a little mod and added the orange epoxy, which is like a little bit tough to see because look at that. If we do that, maybe. Oh gosh, terrible at this. But there's a little orange top on that. See there, maybe that now you can see that in comparison. And so when you have that orange, you can still see it, but it still reacts like the bubble. And so it doesn't scare fish away quite as bad. One of the other features about both of these clear bobbers, though, is depending on the weight of the lure or the jig or whatever you have under this, and in part because they are meant for fly fishing, to get a fly way out there. Those are super, super light. Both of these, I don't know if you can see that wiggle around. It goes in and out of there a little bit. And this one, how it opened up at the top, both of them you can put water in. And so the reason for this is that the water doesn't necessarily weigh that bobber down. It can still keep floating, which is crazy. But when you have that extra water in there, you can cast these out like from here to the end of time, like farther than you can see it, and so just some really unique features. And when you run into them, you're like, a clear bobber, why would I want that? But when you see these things, like, try it out and see, like, why did somebody create it? Because it might be super applicable to what you're doing, how you're fishing.
Yeah, I really do think there's a time and a place for the clear bobbers. They do add a little bit of weight, so you can use some smaller stuff. I personally don't think I have ever found an application for panfish where I've ever had to fill it up with water.
Just I like to use some pretty small jigs. I always have this idea of using like a topwater fly for even like right after spawn when bluegills are still pretty shallow, but like they just love it. You hear them like smacking on the top of the water, all summer you hear that, and it's like, that's bluegills in some cases. And they're eating bugs, and I want to catch them. That's the big ones.
So
back to business. Here we go.
So we've been talking about different styles of bobbers, right? So you have the clip style bobbers that kind of work on a spring, and they use a hook to hold onto the line. You have like slip bobbers. You have the cigar floats that have the pin in them. So you put your line through the top, and then you can peg it in. So you have that. And then you have like the crazy one, the crazy trout ones with the stuff in there. I utilize the slip floats the most. I think they're the most versatile. You can almost mimic any other type of static float with a slip bobber if you adjust your presentation correctly. One thing though is that I personally like to have a roll of what's called dark on, and that's basically tip-up fishing line, but it comes in different colors because it's used in other fishing applications other than tip-up fishing. And I just happen to have a little bit of this stuff that's from DeBro that's orange. I also have some green stuff. And I really like having that in my tackle box and tying my own knots. One, I can control the size of the knot. And two, I can make, if I'm fishing really shallow water and I want to use a really small or a clear bobber, I can make the tag ends really long. I can make them 2 inches long or 3 inches long and have that adjustability so I can see when it hits the end of its line, the bobber is supposed to pop up. If it doesn't pop up, then I know something's wrong. Or if it's not moving, then I know something's wrong and I can bring it back in and adjust. That's just another way to just fine tune your setup. Like I said, I have some green stuff in my tackle box. I just picked this stuff up from DeBro, and that was in a kit. So they have this slip bobber knot tying toolkit. Oh, our green screen's not going to let you see it. There you go. Knot tying toolkit. So it's awesome because it comes with that line, which will probably last you the rest of your life. I have a spool that'll last if I was going to have grandkids, it would last their grandkids' life. It's like a giant spool. But it comes with these tubes, and it comes with this tool. And so this tool allows you to do a nail knot, and you can do a whole bunch of these. These are pre-made ones. You can do a whole bunch of those so you have them on hand, or you can just use that tool and be able to do it on your line without having to retie everything. And that's why I think that's another reason why just having this in your boat is awesome, because if your knot wears out, which they do, you're sliding them up and down, especially on braid, sometimes they can just get cut. Then you don't have to take everything apart to put a knot on, because that's the first part of a slip bobber. You can just tie a new one on and you're good to go. So check that out, that Pro Series slip bobber knot tying toolkit.
But that's fun because then you can choose your color and you can, choose to make it ahead of time or tie it right on the line. Because like Josh said, there's always that instance where all of a sudden it's like, what the heck happened to the knot? And it's like literally, how does that come off the line? Like nobody knows.
It does though.
It does, like magic. It's like, what the heck? And it takes a while for them to wear out, but it's always at the worst time. And so if you are able to, have that little tool that just helps you tie it right back straight onto your line, you're not taking things apart. That is really nice in a fast bite. Or let's say that you're out there, you're trying to get all the kids out and you're just trying to keep up. Anything that's fast is going to be great in that situation.
Yeah. So we had another question. So Dawn is asking us about fill bobbers. So the funny thing about Fill Company is they make a bunch of bobbers, but she mentions that the pink is very visible at dusk. Emily does have some pink ones. This is a fill. I have lighted fill ones. Those are really visible at nighttime. There's the thing is that, I think maybe you're talking something like their bubblegum series. So they have pink ones, orange ones, green ones, this blue one.
But like she's pointing out as well is, sometimes we think, oh, it's orange and yellow and pink or green, just for funsies. And, yeah, that's true. Or if you have a bunch of people in the boat, you cast it out, which one is yours. Mm-hmm. Sorting purposes. Yeah, that's true. But quite frankly, I think a lot of it does come down to visibility. And so you're pointing out that pink seems to stand out at dusk. And then between like orange and yellow, there's always the one, is it yellow? And I can never see it if you're like casting into a glare. Like I always personally hate using a yellow bobber. You think chartreuse is visible, but it's not. But it also makes me think like, can the fish see it? And so earlier in the day, we talked about the Clearly Outdoors slip lock bobbers, and that's one of the reasons that I like those. I wonder how much of this that you can see. Give me 1 second.
Well, and Clearly Outdoors also makes stops that are pretty convenient.
And so we'll talk about that, but you can see here, this is just some of the colors. It's a little bit hard to transition into the camera. So this orange and yellow, but the nice thing is that there doesn't have to be like an up and a down with these. So if you can see the yellow better, if you can see the orange better, if you need that quick swap, that's something you can choose. They have options. There's like this full black one. That's pretty cool. Like I can see that on a sunny day, but I imagine that a fish looking up maybe can't. It's a shadow. Or maybe you need the white. You know, I mean, that all depends on sunny day, cloudy day, weather conditions, wind, not this, that, or maybe you just want green or pink for fun. And I mean, when you get to choose that, that's part of the fun.
Yeah. So that company, just another quick thing, because I don't want to spend all day on products. But they also, this green screen is horrible for bobbers because half of them are just green. So they make something called, it says Smart Stop Micro, and it comes in this cool little carrying case, and it has notches here, and so you can put your line in the notch, and then you just snap it closed with the pliers, and it's on.
Well, and if we were helpful at all, then we'd be able to tell you that this year there's a new version that you don't even need the pliers.
Oh yeah, that's true.
And so like
Yeah,
on
if we
this
were
one,
helpful.
yeah, you could see that those little pieces, you line it right up. And then each of those little bobber stops like goes right on. In the new version, there's like little finger clips around the outside, so it's slightly larger around. It still fits in my tackle box, but then you don't need the pliers to pinch it on, because you can pinch these straight onto your line again without taking anything apart. And I find that I do like those. Not every diameter of line holds it perfectly, but for spring fishing, you have less issues than, for example, ice fishing.
Yeah, and they work probably best on that monofilament. So okay, so we kind of covered the floats. Now, what are you doing with them? So now you got your weapon prepared, right? You have your rod and your reel and your line, and you pick the right float, and you have your perfect jig set up. You go out to the water, you're standing on the edge of the lake, and you're like, okay, you cast it out, it hits the water. Now what? So this is one of my favorite topics, because I believe that floats are the float itself is a tool, but the float and then everything underneath it, all of that is one lure. So you fish it like one lure. You don't try and fish the jig underneath it. You fish the whole thing as a lure. And so it's hard to explain because it sounds goofy, but you're using the bobber as something that you can cast into places where maybe you couldn't cast a small jig, and you let it sit there, and then you can pull it out, and you pull it out, and then you reel it back up, and you can cast at that same spot from different angles, from shore, from a boat, doesn't matter. Another thing that you can do is some of the best days of float fishing is when you have 5 or 10 mile an hour wind, because you can come to a tree and imagine like my hand's a tree here, and the wind's blowing across this way. So it's coming across the front, side to side. I can cast on this side, let my line float all the way around the front of that tree, and then you just pull the opposite direction. You don't pull your bobber through the tree, you pull it away from where your line ends up. And so your bobber will just follow all the way around the front of that tree, and you can fish that whole tree in one cast. And what that does is, one, there's less disturbance to the fish because you're not plopping and plopping and plopping and plopping. It keeps your bait in their face longer. You can let it pause. On those days, you don't really even have to move. You don't have to provide a lot of action because your bobber is going like this a lot of times. And then you move it and it goes up, and then it comes back down, and then it's going like this. And so,
which is a quick side note in itself, is like, go use worms if you want, but this is a plastic situation because this is giving that plastic action.
Yeah. So think of it like that, and you utilize your whole system when you're using floats. And that's why you have a dedicated rod to it, because it's not something you throw on because nothing else is working. It's something you throw on because it will always work. You just have to figure out what you need to do to have it work.
So one of the things that I think of floats, or I guess I've learned, is, and that's why I say don't think of it as it's for kids, because I think of floats, bobbers, as a precision tool. And I know that sounds really crazy, but what you are able to do is, we started this whole episode talking about finding where the fish were relating. Is that a weed bed? Is that a depth? Is it this? Is it that? But in that process, you will also then find out where they are in that water column. Are they hitting as soon as it hits the water, they're really up high? Is it waiting until they drop, or they have to target it or come, like, are they at the bottom? Are they in the middle? But you're able to then set that bobber depth exactly to, well, and not where the fish are, but a little bit above that. Because again, when the fish are looking up, and usually you're doing this daytime, and so all of that light, you can shadow that plastic, get that higher in the water column, because they will see it, especially if it's a sunny day. That light goes through the water and they can see all that different bait that's around there. And so get that bobber set just to be a little bit above where the fish are at, where they're eating. And then you are able to explore all of those different areas and know that, hey, you're casting out. And let's say that you don't have a float and your jig hits the water, and then, it floats down, and maybe you reel it in, and then you do all these fancy things up and down and whatever, make it swim like it's alive. Or maybe you don't, maybe you dead reel it in. That's an option. But in that situation, you're having to really control that jig being in the strike zone. If you are able to put a float on the top of whatever your lure and jig is, you're able to keep that bait in the strike zone a much greater amount of the time.
Yeah. And so to go along with that, you don't have to keep Jesus. You don't have to keep that float even after you catch a bunch of fish and you stop catching fish off of a certain piece of structure. You can lower your bait and keep catching fish all the way until your bait hits the bottom, because a lot of times, especially panfish, they stack up on each other. And if I would assume a lot of you know that about panfish. That's like rule 1, is that they're a school and they kind of stack. And if you start out too deep, you're pulling fish through that stack, and then they tend to disperse. But with floats, you can pick off the top ones and then move it down a little bit, and pick off the middle ones and then move it down a little bit, pick off the bottom ones. You could sit and fish one tree if you really wanted to for, an hour or more, catch a bunch of fish off of it, and then go right next door to the next tree and do the same thing. Me personally, I think this float fishing technique, especially in a boat, lends itself well to moving. So if you've ever watched any professional bass fishing, I'll go like a half mile an hour, or a 0.5 mile an hour, 0.4 mile an hour. And Emily and I just pitch up, and she'll pitch in the front of the boat and pick spots. And then I keep track of her spots and I pitch in between her spots. So we cover the whole shoreline between the two of us, always casting up of the boat. And then when we get to our floats, reel them up, cast up, and we can fish, some of these smaller bodies of water. You can fish that whole shoreline all the way around, especially in the summertime when the temperature evens out. This mutt.
This cat, yeah, it's just
so. So you have that. Don't forget, this is not just a lake thing. We just moved up to Antigo. We're excited to fish lakes, but we spent the last 5 years fishing the Wolf River system, the Winnebago system, the Fox River. This is an awesome technique, especially like mid current. Some of the current seams, you can drift floats down for panfish. We caught crappies like in the middle of the river in log jams.
Yes, there you go.
During the day, finding big log piles, and you can run floats by them. Places where maybe you couldn't get a jig to sit long enough for a fish to be able to see it. So these are all, this is all like lakes, streams, rivers. It's like applicable everywhere. If you want to, there's some really cool river floats out there. So if you are interested in the topic of floats, look up European float fishing for carp, and they have a whole different style of float that has a big metal pin coming out at the bottom that they use rubber bands to hold to their line. And the reason they don't attach their line to the top of the bobber is because when you are holding your bobber in the current and it's attached to that pin has less resistance than the float part. So it cuts through the current and your bobber stays in place. Super cool. And I have some of those made for that application for panfish. Steelhead fishermen are a wealth of knowledge for float fishing. That's some, drift floating is super huge in that realm. If you pay attention to walleye fishing, power corking, that's not new to that realm, but it's coming back. And fishing walleyes with floats during tournaments. Tournaments are being won using floats, and so this is not something that is, like Emily said, that's for kids off a dock, sit there and watch it for 10 minutes. This is a serious tool, like, that you can use and be successful, especially when other people aren't, because a lot of times this is just enough of a slowdown, especially in the summer when you have some of those tough bites and you're trying to figure out how to slow down. You can fish this stuff really slow, but continue to move and find fish. But it's just enough of a slowdown that maybe you're the only one on the lake catching fish that day because everybody else is fishing too fast or all the way slowed down. Like they just stopped and are sitting there with floats. And so finding that in between is like, it's just really fun to just get into it and just like fine tune this skill.
And, the cool thing is that once you do learn that tactic or technique, find the bobber, the situation that works for you, it does become very doable. It does become very easy. And I started this off by saying bobbers are not for kids, but the great thing is that they can be.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's not kids, maybe this is your friend who doesn't fish often. Maybe this is your neighbor who can't cast. Maybe it's somebody who's aging and isn't able to, fish like they used to, but anybody is able to get out there and watch a bobber. And so that is a super great application. The other thing that I'm actually kind of sitting here and laughing about was it a few weeks ago, we talked to somebody and they were talking about they use permanent markers to color their plastics. Who was that? Coots Lures.
Yeah.
Coots Lures was talking about that. Coot. He brings even just highlighters. It wasn't even permanent markers. And he
highlighters.
Colors his plastics. Highlighters would not work for bobbers, but if you are having markers in the boat, you can have each of those kids or friends or whoever, decorate their own bobber. And that would be kind of a fun challenge when you're hitting the water, is everyone using their custom bobber. So, some fun ways to be able to get some new people out and experiencing fishing and the fun that it can offer. But at the same time, you can be out there and you can be a serious fisherman looking for a giant panfish or walleye or whatever.
Yeah. And so like I'm always game for talking floats. So anybody that watches this episode, like if no matter when you see this, if it's 10 years from now or if it's 10 minutes from now, if you have questions, message me on Facebook. Email us, whatever, just get a hold of us and we can walk you through some more specifics. And you know what? If you're fishing with this or you're fishing with this, there's an application for a bobber. So, or a float, So, that if just get out there and try it, experiment, customize, 2-part, 5-minute epoxy is your friend. Don't be afraid to like fine tune your floats. If you have all you have is a balsa float in your box and you don't want to go spend $8 on a new one that's smaller, take some sandpaper to it. Spray it down with some spray paint and you're off to the races. So don't be afraid to customize your stuff, fine tune it,
and have fun. I guess that's a perfect ending. I would love to sit here and continue talking bobbers. There's a million things that we haven't even talked about, haven't even covered. So maybe someday there will be a part 2 of this episode.
Maybe someday we'll get to do a seminar at a show.
But who knows?
Yeah.
And either way, in the meantime, hopefully this weather's being good to you, and hopefully you are out and able to catch some fish. And either way, we're looking forward to seeing you guys on next week's edition of The Night Bite.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.